Under the cloak of nightfall, Harrington and his accomplices had crossed a boundary, both literal and moral. They had manipulated an elderly man, tried to seize private property, and abused the very legal framework I had sworn to uphold throughout my career. As the sun dipped below the ranch's ridgeline, I made a decision. This was no longer just about defending my land. This was about confronting a corrupt organization that was systematically threatening an entire community. And as a federal judge, with over 30 years of courtroom experience, I knew exactly how to do that. The next morning at precisely 7 a.m., a professional surveyor arrived. Her name was Linda Peterson, a precision-driven woman with a reputation that preceded her, Samantha's most trusted recommendation. For 3 uninterrupted hours, Linda methodically measured every inch of my property. Her equipment, state-of-the-art, GPS-based instruments left no room for doubt or ambiguity. She mapped out the full boundary, including the 5 acres I'd lawfully purchased from Elijah Williams. "Your property line is exactly where your original deed states," she told me, showing a detailed map on her tablet. "The HOA fence is encroaching by approximately 12 feet, seizing roughly 0.82 acres of your land." She handed me certified documentation, complete with time-stamped photographs, measurement data, and her licensed assessment, evidence that would be airtight in any courtroom. Just as Linda was packing up her equipment, a sleek black SUV rolled up my driveway, its glossy exterior bearing the Lakeside Estates logo. Jeremy Foster stepped out, a man with sharp eyes, tailored suit, and a politician's practiced grin. His appearance alone felt like a statement, polished intimidation in the middle of ranchland dust. "Mr. Richardson," he called out in a tone soaked with artificial cheer. "Hope I'm not intruding. Thought we might have a friendly chat about the property situation." I introduced him to Linda, pointedly noting her credentials. His smile dimmed for a second, then returned with plastic confidence. "Well, surveys can be interpreted in many ways," he said, brushing off the facts. "That's why I came personally, to reach an amicable solution without getting tangled in technicalities." I led him to the porch and offered him iced tea. He declined. I listened as he outlined his so-called generous offer. Lakeside Estates would let me retain most of my land if I joined the HOA, removed all livestock and farming operations, complied with their aesthetic standards, and accepted their authority over the disputed 5 acres. In return, they'd forgive the mounting fines they had claimed I owed and grant me a 1-year grace period to conform to their regulations. I almost laughed. The audacity was almost admirable. "Well, Mr. Foster, here's my counteroffer," I replied. "Lakeside Estates will immediately remove their illegally installed fence, restore my property to its original condition, issue a written admission that those 5 acres are not under your jurisdiction, and publicly apologize for this unlawful land grab. In exchange, I won't press civil charges for trespassing, property damage, and attempted fraud." His smile vanished. The predator behind the attorney mask revealed itself. "Mr. Richardson," he said, voice now cold and clipped, "let me be clear. Lakeside Estates has deep roots and influence in this county. Things don't always work by the book here. Fighting this will cost you, financially, emotionally. Many have opposed us before, none succeeded." It was a threat, barely veiled. "Is that a threat, Mr. Foster?" I asked, voice calm. "Not at all," he replied, smoothing his tie. "Just a pragmatic warning. Victor asked me to convey that Sun Ridge Development is willing to purchase your entire property for 20% above market value. One-time offer. Ends this conflict completely." I stood. The conversation was over. "Tell Mr. Harrington that my land is not for sale at any price, and he has 48 hours to remove that fence. After that, I'll see you in court." As he climbed into the SUV, he gave one last parting shot. "Retirement should be peaceful, Mr. Richardson. Don't spend yours fighting unwinnable battles." He drove off, tires spitting dust across my drive. I watched him go, then allowed myself a tight smile. He didn't know I had recorded the entire conversation. Texas law allows one-party consent for audio recordings, and I had captured every thinly veiled threat and admission of collusion. Even better, He had linked the HOA directly to Sunridge. Evidence. Later that afternoon, an official letter arrived from Lakeside Estates Valley HOA. 17 alleged violations were listed against my property, with fines accumulating daily, at $750. The document claimed I had breached community standards and gave me 10 days to comply, or face enforcement. The paperwork included their declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, a bloated 50-page document that supposedly gave them jurisdiction over my property. Their foundation for this claim? The forged agreement involving Elijah. I faxed the entire packet to Samantha. Her call came within the hour. "This is gold," she said. "They've written down their lies, and it all contradicts county records. I'm drafting the injunction request now. In the meantime, document everything, every visit, every word, every piece of paper." The very next morning, I caught Greg Mitchell, the same HOA board member who had tried to reason with me once, standing at the property line with 2 other men. They were taking photographs and hammering in stakes. This time even further into my land I approached. Greg stiffened. "Routine documentation," he said, eyes not quite meeting mine. "Board requested updated images for compliance purposes." The 2 workers were hammering in markers branded with the HOA logo. I hit record on my phone. "You're trespassing," I said evenly. "Leave. Now." Greg looked like he wanted to say more but simply nodded at the others. They packed up and left. As he turned to go, he muttered, "It's not personal, Mr. Richardson. Just doing my job." The tone in his voice, something uneasy, almost apologetic, wasn't lost on me, a crack in the armor. 3 days later, Samantha filed our emergency injunction against Lakeside Estates Valley HOA. It demanded they cease all attempts to alter boundaries, enforce violations, or enter my property. We included everything: sworn, affidavits from Linda Peterson and Elijah Williams, the survey documents, the photos, and, of course, the recording of Jeremy's visit. We even attached the HOA's own fraudulent documents. The case landed on the desk of Judge Harold Bennett, an old colleague. Fair, by the book, and not the type to play favorites. I trusted him to rule on the evidence alone. That evening, Sarah called with more news. Victor had launched a media campaign. The story had hit local news. Property owners blocking community progress. He painted himself as a visionary developer, held back by stubborn landowners clinging to the past. It was clever, manipulative, dangerous. I made one more call, this time to Thomas Reed. He was an investigative journalist with a nose for corruption. Years ago, I'd presided over a case where he sued a government agency for access to sealed records. He'd impressed me then, and I trusted him now. I didn't reveal my position, just gave him a nudge. "There's something strange about Lakeside Estates and Sunridge Development," I said. "You might find it worth looking into." The battle lines were clear. Victor was turning up the pressure. But what he didn't realize was that every move he made was building my case. Piece by piece, I was collecting the tools to bring down his empire. Then came the hearing. The courtroom was packed. Victor had filled the seats with supporters. He sat with Jeremy Foster and a legal team, smiling, confident, untouchable. Our side was smaller, just me, Samantha, and Elijah, who insisted on testifying despite his health. Judge Bennett entered. Samantha presented our case like clockwork. The survey, the forged documents, the threats. Elijah's testimony, raw and sincere, hit the room like a weight. The judge listened closely, eyes narrowing. Then Jeremy took the floor. Polished, smooth. He portrayed us as relics, out of step. With progress. Said the boundary issues were harmless corrections. Said Elijah's memory was unreliable. Lakeside Estates only seeks to build a beautiful community, he said. Mr. Richardson and Mr. Williams oppose it from stubborn nostalgia. Everything was going according to their plan, until Judge Bennett asked a simple question. "Mr. Richardson, you're listed as retired. Could you clarify your professional background for the court?" I felt Samantha shift beside me. I stood. "Your Honor, I am a senior judge of the United States District Court, currently on extended leave after the passing of my wife. I excluded my title to avoid any bias. The room exploded with whispers. Jeremy's face went white. Victor froze. The judge blinked slowly, absorbing the revelation. To be clear, he asked, you allege the defendants knowingly submitted fraudulent documents to this court? I do. And we have the evidence. The atmosphere shifted. Victor's supporters looked uneasy. Jeremy was whispering furiously to Victor. Then, like a moment scripted for drama, the doors opened. A woman entered, Diana Foster, Jeremy's wife. She approached the bench. Your Honor, she said, I have evidence. Emails from my husband's laptop. They prove a conspiracy between the HOA and Sunridge Development. The room fell silent, and just like that, their carefully spun web began to unravel. Estates HOA, Sunridge Development, and several county officials had conspired to acquire property through fraudulent means. I cannot remain silent while my husband participates in illegal activity that harms innocent people, she stated, firmly, handing a USB drive to the court clerk. Everything is documented here. The forged agreements, the kickbacks from Sunridge, the bribes to county officials, all of it. Jeremy leapt to his feet, shouting that his wife was lying, that she had no right to access his private communications, and that this was all part of their ongoing divorce dispute. Judge Bennett banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Mr. Foster, control yourself or I will have you removed, he thundered. Once order was restored, Judge Bennett announced he would review the new evidence in chambers before proceeding. He recessed court for 1 hour, directing all parties to remain available. As he left the bench, Victor grabbed Jeremy's arm, hissing accusations that were audible to those nearby. You said this was foolproof. You guaranteed a judge would never touch this case. During the recess, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Victor and Jeremy huddled with their legal team, occasionally casting venomous glances in our direction. I sat quietly, maintaining the judicial composure that had become second nature over decades. Inside, however, I felt a deep satisfaction, not just because our case was strong, but because the corruption I'd spent my career fighting was being exposed in such a decisive manner. Samantha was reviewing Deanna's evidence on her laptop, occasionally whispering updates to me. This is incredible, she murmured at one point. They've been doing this for years. At least 12 properties acquired through similar tactics, all eventually sold to Sunridge at massive profits. When Judge Bennett returned, his expression was grave. Having reviewed the evidence presented by Mrs. Foster, I find sufficient cause for immediate action. This court grants the emergency injunction prohibiting Lakeside Estates Valley HOA from modifying any property boundaries, enforcing alleged violations, or entering the plaintiff's property. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation regarding potential fraud, forgery, and official misconduct. He fixed Victor and Jeremy with a stern gaze. Given the serious nature of these allegations and the involvement of an officer of the court, I am also referring Mr. Foster to the State Bar Ethics Committee. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Victor was on his feet, shouting about conspiracies and corrupt judges. Jeremy sat in stunned silence, his career crumbling before his eyes. Several HOA supporters slipped quietly from the room, distancing themselves from the unfolding disaster. Judge Bennett banged his gavel repeatedly. Order! One more outburst, Mr. Harrington, and you'll be held in contempt. When quiet finally returned, Judge Bennett continued. This court will reconvene in 2 weeks for a full hearing on all matters related to this case. In the meantime, the defendants are ordered to restore all property boundaries to their original state, as documented in county records, within 72 hours. Court is adjourned. As we gathered our materials, a tall, well-dressed man approached our table. Judge Richardson, Richard Hughes, CEO of Sunridge Development. He offered his hand, which I didn't take. I want to assure you that my company had no knowledge of Mr. Harrington's illegal activities. We contracted with Lakeside Estates in good faith to purchase properly acquired properties. Perhaps we could discuss a resolution that would be agreeable to all parties. Sunridge would be willing to offer substantial compensation for any inconvenience. His smile was practiced. confident, the expression of a man accustomed to buying his way out of problems. Before I could respond, a woman stepped forward from where she had been observing the proceedings. "Mr. Hughes, I'm Special Agent Lisa Morgan, FBI," she said quietly, flashing her credentials. "We'll need to speak with you regarding potential violations of federal wire fraud statutes and conspiracy charges. Your company's financial transactions with Lakeside Estates and several county officials have been under investigation for some time." Hughes's confident facade crumbled instantly. He glanced frantically around the courtroom, perhaps looking for an escape route. But two more agents had appeared at the exits. The elaborate scheme that Victor Harrington had orchestrated was collapsing with breathtaking speed, taking down everyone involved. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, alerted by the sudden FBI presence. Thomas Reed, the investigative journalist I'd contacted, was at the front of the pack. "Judge Richardson, can you comment on the allegations against Lakeside Estates? Were you targeted specifically because of your judicial position?" I declined to comment on ongoing proceedings, but did make one statement. "Today's events demonstrate that no one is above the law, regardless of their local influence or connections. Property rights are fundamental in our society, and attempts to subvert them through fraud or intimidation will not stand." Over the following weeks, the full extent of the conspiracy unfolded. Victor Harrington had been receiving kickbacks of 15% on every property acquired for Sunridge, with additional payments to Jeremy Foster for creating fraudulent documents and bribing county officials. The planned development wasn't just a typical suburban expansion. It was to be a luxury resort and golf course that would have dramatically altered the character of Willow Creek while generating millions in profit for Sunridge council member. James Wilson was implicated in approving zoning changes in exchange for bribes, and several county employees were suspended pending investigation for their roles in processing fraudulent paperwork. The scandal made headlines beyond our region, becoming a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and development corruption. During this time, I received numerous calls from former victims of Victor's scheme, thanking me for standing up to him when no one else could. Elijah especially seemed rejuvenated by the outcome, his eyes bright with vindication as he sat on his porch, telling anyone who would listen about how Maxwell showed those city slickers what real justice looks like. For my part, I found myself unexpectedly thrust into a community leadership role, a position I'd never sought but couldn't ethically decline, given my unique ability to navigate the legal aftermath. The FBI investigation expanded to include other Sunridge developments across 3 states, uncovering similar tactics used to acquire land through manipulated HOA regulations. Richard Hughes attempted to distance himself from the scandal by claiming ignorance of operational details, but email records told a different story. He had personally approved the strategy of using HOAs as acquisition vehicles and had directed his subordinates to secure properties by any means necessary. His arrest on multiple federal charges sent shockwaves through the real estate development industry, serving as a powerful reminder that corporate malfeasance would face consequences. 6 months later, I had returned to my position on the bench when Chief Judge Reynolds informed me of the case conclusion. Guilty on all counts. 8 years for Hughes, 5 for Harrington, 3 for Foster with disbarment. She noted I could have stopped it with one phone call, revealing my position, but I explained it would have been preferential treatment, and it wouldn't have uncovered the broader conspiracy. Sometimes justice needs to follow its proper course. The legitimate Lakeside Estates homeowners formed the Willow Creek Community Council under Amanda Pierce's leadership, transforming the antagonistic relationship between development and surrounding properties into collaboration. Greg Mitchell, who had followed Victor's orders uncomfortably, now directed restoration projects repairing environmental damage. We established the Willow Creek Youth Education Fund with settlement money, providing scholarships including one for Jeremy's innocent daughter, Rachel. When the committee hesitated due to her father's crimes, I advocated, "We cannot punish children for the sins of their parents." Rachel later wrote, expressing her determination to study environmental law to prevent similar exploitation. My property was restored to its original boundaries, and Elijah and I created a conservation easement protecting his land from future development. Sarah and I grew closer, our friendship deepening into something more meaningful. Two public servants committed to their communities in complementary ways. 1 year after the fence incident, workers removed the ostentatious Lakeside Estates entrance monument, replacing it with a simple marker reading, Willow Creek Community. 1887. Standing beside Elijah at the unveiling, I felt a sense of completion beyond legal victory. This hadn't just been about property boundaries, but about the boundary between right and wrong, between exploitation and stewardship, between corruption and justice. Karma may not be a legal concept, but in this case it operated with remarkable precision. Victor, Jeremy, Richard, and their accomplices paid heavily for their greed and deception. They chose the wrong person to target, and the consequences were exactly what they deserved. Severe sentences that reflected the calculated nature of their crimes. I've been practicing law for 35 years, but never thought I'd have to face bastards right in my own backyard. When the HOA started moving my property boundary fence, they had no idea they were messing with the wrong man, a senior judge at the district court. Today, I'm going to tell you how I taught a greedy HOA and their arrogant president a lesson they'll never forget. It wasn't just about property lines. It was a battle between justice and bottomless greed. And trust me, the ending will make you feel so satisfied that, well, I shouldn't spoil it too early. Let's start this story properly, but hey, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below to let me know which state you're in. And if you've ever been hassled by an HOA, share your experience briefly. After Sandra passed away, the house in the suburbs felt emptier than ever. 30 years of marriage ended by cancer, leaving me with nothing but memories and an overwhelming silence. That's when I decided to return to Willow Creek, where I grew up. My family's old ranch had been sitting mostly unused since my parents passed, with a caretaker checking in occasionally. It wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a homecoming, a chance to reconnect with my roots while I figured out how to live in a world without my wife. The rolling hills, the open spaces, and the simple rhythm of country life felt like exactly what I needed to heal. The ranch wasn't large by Texas standards, about 20 acres with a modest 2-story farmhouse that had stood since the 1940s. It needed work, but that suited me fine. Physical labor would keep my hands busy and my mind occupied. What made the property special was that it bordered Elijah Williams' land, my father's oldest friend and the man who taught me to ride horses when I was just a boy. Elijah was pushing, 80 now, his weathered face like a map of the county's history. When I told him I was moving back, he insisted on selling me 5 acres of his adjacent property, land that contained a small creek where he and my father used to fish, and where I'd spent countless summer days as a child. "Maxwell, my boy," he'd said, his voice cracking with age but eyes still bright. "This land should be yours. Your daddy and I always said our families should share this piece of heaven. Sandra would have loved it here." He was right. My late wife had always talked about retiring to the countryside. The judge's chambers and courtrooms had been my world, for so long that I'd forgotten the simple pleasure of watching the sunrise over open fields. At 58, I wasn't exactly young, but I wasn't ready for a rocking chair either. The district court had been understanding, granting me extended leave, a sabbatical of sorts, though I knew I'd eventually return to the bench. For now, I was just Max Richardson, a man trying to rebuild his life. Not Judge Richardson, who struck fear into unprepared attorneys. Sarah Johnson, the local sheriff, was one of the few people who knew my actual position. We'd gone to high school together before life took us in different directions, and reconnecting with her felt like finding a piece of my past self. "Max, it's good to have you back," she'd said over coffee at the local diner, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Just don't go sentencing any of my deputies when they give you a speeding ticket." I laughed, for what felt like the first time in months. Sarah had always been sharp as a tack, and 25 years in law enforcement had only honed that edge. She was divorced, dedicated to her job, and one of the most straightforward people I'd ever known. A quality I'd always appreciated. It was Sarah who first mentioned Lakeside Estates Valley HOA to me. "They've been causing headaches for everyone around here," she explained, stirring her coffee absently. "They started about 5 years ago with a small subdivision, but they've been expanding aggressively, trying to incorporate surrounding properties. Some folks feel they're overstepping, but they have connections with the city council. I nodded, only half interested at the time. HOAs were common enough, and while they could be a nuisance, they seemed like a minor concern compared to rebuilding my life. How wrong I was. How utterly, catastrophically wrong. The trouble started 3 weeks after I'd finished the paperwork for Elijah's 5 acres. Maria Gonzalez, who helped around the ranch a few days a week, called me in a panic while I was in town. "Senor Max, there are men moving your fence. They say they have permission, but I don't believe them." I thanked her and immediately headed home, my judicial calm already giving way to a simmering irritation. Who would touch another person's property? Without permission? The answer, as I would soon discover, was Victor Harrington, a man whose arrogance was matched only by his greed, and who was about to make the biggest mistake of his life by crossing a federal judge. I arrived to find a crew of 4 men dismantling the old fence that had stood along the property line for decades. They were replacing it with a new uniform white picket fence, about 15 feet inside my actual property line. A heavy-set man in his 40s was directing the operation, consulting what looked like a map spread across the hood of a truck. I parked my old Ford pickup and approached calmly, years of courtroom composure serving me well. "Excuse me," I said, my voice carrying the polite authority I'd perfected over decades on the bench. "May I ask what you're doing on my property?" The man looked up, barely bothering to mask his annoyance at the interruption. "I'm Greg Mitchell, landscaping manager for Lakeside Estates Valley HOA," he replied, extending a hand that I didn't shake. "We're adjusting the fence line according to the new property boundaries approved by the community board." His tone suggested this was routine. Nothing worth questioning, which immediately raised every red flag in my legally trained mind. I looked at the map he was using and immediately noticed it wasn't an official county document. It lacked proper seals, signatures, or any legal certification. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," I said carefully. "This is private property. Not part of any HOA. I'm going to have to ask you to stop work immediately and restore my fence to its original position." Greg sighed, as if dealing with a particularly slow child. "Sir, this area falls under Lakeside Estates jurisdiction, according to the revised zoning. If you have concerns, you can take them up with Mr. Harrington at the next HOA meeting." He turned away, clearly considering our conversation over. I pulled out my phone and started recording video of the work being done. "I'll be calling the sheriff," I informed him calmly. "What you're doing constitutes trespassing and destruction of private property. I want your full name and contact information for the HOA president." That got his attention. After a moment's hesitation, he pulled out his phone and stepped away to make a call, speaking in hushed tones while glancing at me periodically. Whatever instructions he received apparently didn't include stopping, because the crew continued working. I called Sarah, who arrived 15 minutes later in her sheriff's patrol car. She surveyed the scene with practiced efficiency, then approached me. "Max, what's going on here?" I explained the situation while showing her the deed to my property, including the recent addition purchased from Elijah. Sarah confronted Greg, who produced his dubious map and a letter with an HOA letterhead authorizing the boundary adjustment. Sarah frowned. "This isn't an official county document, and without a court order, you can't modify someone else's property line. I'm going to have to ask you to stop work until this is sorted out legally." Greg made another call, and this time the voice on the other end was loud enough that I could hear snippets, an angry man demanding the work continue. Sarah took the phone and identified herself as the sheriff, which seemed to change the tone of the conversation. After a brief, tense discussion, Greg reluctantly instructed his crew to pack up, but the damage was already done. My original fence had been dismantled, and nearly 5 feet of my property had been marked as HOA territory, with stakes bearing their logo. As they left, Greg handed me a business card. "Mr. Harrington expects to see you at the HOA meeting tomorrow night at 7 p.m., he said stiffly. "The board will explain everything." Sarah waited until they were gone before speaking. Max, be careful with these people. Victor Harrington has a lot of friends in local government. There have been complaints about his tactics before, but nothing ever sticks. I nodded, thanking her for the intervention, while my legal mind was already cataloging violations and potential courses of action. I'll attend their meeting, I told her. I want to see exactly what I'm dealing with before deciding how to proceed. What I didn't say was that I was already planning my counterattack. In my years on the bench, I'd seen every kind of scheme and scam imaginable. If this HOA thought they could intimidate a federal judge and steal his land, they were about to learn a painful lesson in constitutional property rights. Victor Harrington received 5 years in federal prison for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Jeremy Foster lost his law license and served 3 years for his role in the scheme. Richard Hughes was sentenced to 8 years and ordered to pay millions in restitution to the victims. Bob Thompson received 2 years of probation and 500 hours of community service, his lesser sentence reflecting his secondary role in the operation. I took no particular pleasure in seeing them arrested, but I believe in the legal system I've served my entire life. No one stands above the law, especially those who would manipulate it to take what doesn't belong to them. The investigation ultimately revealed that their scheme had victimized over 20 property owners, many of whom were elderly or facing financial difficulties, making them vulnerable to the HOA's aggressive tactics. The total land illegally acquired exceeded 200 acres, all destined for luxury development that would have forever altered our community's character, while enriching a few corrupt individuals. If there are lessons to be learned from this experience, they might be these. Know your rights. Many people lost their property because they didn't understand their legal protections. Keep meticulous records. Original documents, maps, and meeting minutes were crucial weapons in our legal battle. Community is strength. When people stand together against injustice, they can overcome even well-connected adversaries. And perhaps most importantly, integrity matters. The entire scheme collapsed because individuals like Amanda, Deanna, and eventually Greg chose conscience over complicity. For those facing similar situations, remember that you're not alone. Seek legal assistance, contact property rights organizations, and never surrender your legitimate interests to intimidation. The law may sometimes work slowly, but when properly applied, it remains our strongest defense against those who would use power to exploit others. As for me, the ranch continues to be the peaceful haven my wife and I had envisioned for our retirement. Each morning when I look out across the fields and see horses running freely, I know that this battle was worth every effort. My property boundaries are now respected, but more importantly, the boundary between right and wrong has been affirmed, and to any HOAs or anyone else contemplating using their power to bully others, be careful. You never know who you might be facing across that boundary line. It might just be an old retired man growing tomatoes, or it might be a senior federal judge with 35 years of experience bringing people like you to justice. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment about your experience with HOAs, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed this story. He whispered something to Victor. Victor cleared his throat. Very well. According to our recently updated community maps, the 5 acres you purchased from Mr. Williams fall within our development zone. Mr. Williams signed an agreement last year, acknowledging that his southern parcel, the land you now claim, would be incorporated into Lakeside Estates for future development. I kept my face neutral, but internally, alarm bells were ringing. Elijah had never mentioned this, and it seemed completely out of character for him. May I see this agreement? I asked. Victor nodded to Amanda, who shuffled through some papers before handing him a document, which he did not immediately offer to me. Furthermore, Victor continued, clearly trying to regain control of the narrative. As this land is now part of our HOA jurisdiction, we'll need to discuss bringing your property into compliance with our community standards. The board has noted several violations that must be addressed promptly. Bob Thompson produced a clipboard and began reading. Non-compliant fencing, unapproved livestock presence, unauthorized agricultural activity, non-compliant mailbox design. The list went on. each item more ridiculous than the last. Some residents looked sympathetic. Others seemed to be enjoying the show. I waited until he finished, then spoke with deliberate calm. "Mr. Harrington, I'd like to see the agreement Mr. Williams supposedly signed, along with proof that it was properly notarized and filed with the county clerk's office." Victor slid the paper across the table without meeting my eyes. One glance told me everything I needed to know. The signature was shaky, unlike Elijah's usual confident hand, and the document itself was suspiciously vague about what exactly was being agreed to. "I'd also like to see the HOA's founding documents, bylaws, and any amendments that would give you authority to incorporate new properties without the owner's explicit consent." Amanda shifted uncomfortably in her seat while Victor's face darkened slightly. "Mr. Richardson, perhaps you don't understand how community associations work," Victor said, his condescension barely concealed. "Our board has the authority to make decisions for the good of the entire community. If you're finding our standards too restrictive, there are always options. Sunridge Development has expressed interest in several properties in your area. I'm sure they'd make you a fair offer for your rustic homestead." The threat was clear. Comply or be forced out. I'd heard enough. I stood up, collected the document, and addressed not Victor, but the entire room. "Thank you for your time. I'll be reviewing this situation with appropriate legal counsel. I suggest the board does the same before taking any further action regarding my property." As I turned to leave, Victor called out, "Mr. Richardson, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. We're simply trying to maintain property values and community standards." I paused at the door, looking back at him with a slight smile. "Mr. Harrington, in my experience, people who have the law on their side don't need to rely on intimidation. Good evening." As I walked to my truck, I noticed Amanda hurrying after me. She glanced around nervously before speaking in a low voice. "Mr. Richardson, you should know that several other property owners have been through this. The documents, they aren't always obtained through proper channels." Before I could respond, she hurried back inside, leaving me with confirmation of my suspicions and the first potential ally in what was clearly going to be a battle. On the drive home, I called Sarah and filled her in. "This stinks to high heaven, Max," she said. "But Victor's got half the county council in his pocket. Be careful." I assured her I would be. But as a federal judge, I had resources and knowledge Victor couldn't anticipate. By the time I reached my ranch, I was no longer angry. I was resolved. The next morning, I made a few calls to colleagues at the county records office, the property assessor, and most importantly to Samantha Davis, the best real estate attorney I knew from my days in private practice. Victor Harrington had just declared war on the wrong person. And while he thought he was dealing with a simple retiree, he was about to face the full force of a senior federal judge who knew every nuance of property law and had the connections to enforce it. The following morning, I drove to visit Elijah. His ranch house was smaller than mine but impeccably maintained, with a wide porch where he spent most of his days watching the hills and remembering better times. I found him in his usual rocking chair, a plaid blanket over his knees despite the warm weather. "Max," he greeted me, his voice frail but his eyes still sharp. "You look troubled." I sat beside him and showed him the document Victor had given me. Elijah put on his reading glasses, examined it, and his weathered face creased in confusion. "Never signed this," he said firmly. "That's not my signature, at least not how I normally sign." After some gentle questioning, the truth emerged. About 8 months ago, Elijah had been hospitalized with pneumonia. While he was recovering, Victor and Jeremy Foster, the HOA's lawyer, had visited him with what they claimed were routine, water usage documents that needed his signature. Elijah, foggy from medication and trusting by nature, had signed without reading carefully. "I feel like a fool, Max," he admitted, shame evident in his voice. "Managed this land for 60 years, and I let some smooth-talking city slicker trick me like a greenhorn." I assured him this wasn't his fault and promised to make it right, my judicial calm barely containing my growing anger at the exploitation of a vulnerable elderly man. From Elijah's place, I drove straight to the county records office where Michael Chen, the clerk, was an old acquaintance from my early days as a judge. I didn't disclose my current position, simply saying I was researching property boundaries for personal reasons. Michael was efficient and discreet, helping me access the original plat maps for both my property and the Lakeside Estates development. The discrepancy was immediately obvious. The HOA's updated community maps had been modified to include not just my 5 acres, but portions of several other adjacent properties. More troublingly, these changes had been submitted to the county, but hadn't gone through proper approval. Channel's next stop was the county assessor's office, where Deborah Walker had been working since before I left Willow Creek. "Judge Richardson," she whispered, recognizing me immediately despite my attempts at anonymity. "Don't worry, your secret's safe with me." She pulled the tax records for my property and confirmed what I suspected. The 5 acres I'd purchased from Elijah were still officially listed as his property for tax purposes, with no record of any HOA jurisdiction. "There's something odd going on with Lakeside Estates," she confided. "They've been filing paperwork claiming all sorts of boundary adjustments, but most of it hasn't been properly processed. My supervisor keeps telling me to be flexible with their submissions." By afternoon, I was sitting in Samantha Davis's office in the city, 40 minutes from Willow Creek. Samantha had been one of the sharpest attorneys to ever appear in my courtroom, specializing in real estate law and property disputes. Now in private practice, she listened intently as I laid out the situation, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair with a low whistle. "They picked the wrong person to mess with, that's for sure. What they're doing is clearly illegal on multiple fronts: fraud, elder exploitation, falsifying official documents, trespassing, destruction of property, the list goes on." She tapped her pen thoughtfully. "But proving it will require more than just your word against theirs, even with your position." Samantha suggested a methodical approach. "First, hire a professional surveyor to officially document my property boundaries. Second, collect statements from other affected property owners. Third, file for an emergency injunction to prevent any further boundary modifications while we built our case. And most crucially, document everything. These types of operations usually leave a paper trail," she explained. "People like Victor get careless when they think they're untouchable. Our job is to find where they've slipped up." I agreed to her plan, though I decided to hold off on revealing my position as a judge until absolutely necessary. There was a certain strategic advantage in being underestimated. On my way home, I stopped by Frank Miller's farm. Frank was another longtime resident whose property bordered the HOA development. Sarah had mentioned he'd had his own run-ins with Victor. Frank was initially hesitant to talk, a gruff, private man in his 60s who clearly distrusted strangers. But when I explained my situation, something in him broke. "They took 2 acres from me last year," he admitted, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Claimed it was always part of their development plan. I fought it, hired a lawyer and everything, but they had paperwork I supposedly signed. Cost me $15,000 in legal fees before I gave up. Now they're using that land for some fancy community, garden their residents barely visit." By the time I returned to my ranch that evening, I had a clearer picture of what we were facing. Victor Harrington wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. He was running a sophisticated land grab operation, targeting vulnerable property owners and using a combination of fraudulent documents, legal intimidation, and political connections to expand Lakeside Estates territory. The question was, why? Pure greed seemed too simple an explanation for the effort involved. There had to be something more valuable at stake. As if in answer to my unspoken question, my phone rang. It was Amanda Pierce, the HOA secretary, calling from what sounded like a public phone. "Mr. Richardson, I can't talk long. You need to look into Sunridge Development and their connection to Victor. There's a major resort development planned for your area, but they need consolidated land parcels. Just be careful. Victor has friends in dark places." She hung up before I could ask any questions, but her call confirmed my suspicions. This wasn't just about extending HOA control. It was about acquiring land for commercial development, with Victor likely receiving kickbacks for each parcel he managed to secure. That night I sat on my porch watching the sunset over Elijah's now my 5 acres, with its small creek glimmering in the fading light. The land wasn't just valuable real estate. It was a piece of my history, a connection to my parents and my childhood, and now it represented something else, a line in the sand.